Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It is 3 o'clock now, so we are going to get started with today's webinar. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We're happy to have you all here today for the webinar, To Be or Not to Be a 501c3. My name is Amber Sheeran, and I am the Program and Events Director for the Michigan Library Association, and I will be hosting today's webinar along with Rachel Ash, who's also here assisting me as well. A few things to note before we get started. Your camera and your microphone are muted. If you have any questions as we go through our presentation, please type them in the chat box. We will be monitoring the chat box and we'll respond if we're able, but primarily we'll save questions till the end of the presentation when we will go through them. When you type a question, you have the option to send it to all panelists or all panelists and attendees. If it's not a private question, please make sure that you send it to all attendees as well so that everyone can see if there are repeats of the same question. So you may have a question that other attendees also have. So if everyone can see those, then we won't get quite as many duplicates. This webinar is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal advice. So please consult your library's lawyers for any legal advice specifically pertaining to your own library. This is just for informational purposes. I do want to make everyone aware that today's webinar is being recorded. So we will have this available for later viewing on MLA's website. So if you want to refer back, it will be made available. You will also get a survey emailed to you after the conclusion of the webinar. It only takes about 2 minutes to complete that survey. So if you have time, please complete that and send that back to us. It helps us provide better content for you and correct any issues that may have come up. So please take a couple minutes to complete that. So with that, it is now my pleasure to welcome Clare Membiela. She is the library law consultant from the Library of Michigan. Clare, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. Well, I'm going to turn the controls over to you now. So thank
Okay.
you so much, and I will let you get started.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming here at 3 o'clock. I know that it's kind of the perfect storm of late afternoon and boringness. Tax law is among the most boring aspects of the law, and I say that as someone who really loves the law. But tax is kind of a very special animal. So I'm going to do my best to make this as scintillating as I possibly can. I thought about maybe rapping it or singing it, but I think that would actually be perhaps less palatable. So I'm going to do the best I can, and I hope you have a very caffeinated beverage. And so here we go. I am glad that Amber mentioned that this is not legal advice. I provide legal information, but I don't provide legal advice, especially with topics like tax law, which can be very complicated and can be very individual per library. So you can have 2 libraries and one could get a 501c3 designation and the other one could possibly not. There are, many considerations that they use and different criteria, and depending on your library and how it was established and how it operates, and some very specific processes within it and how it does things, it may not be eligible. So it's very important that you contact your attorney and that you work with them because one size really doesn't fit all when you're trying to be a 501c3. So you want to be extra sure it's definitely worth the money, okay, to get an attorney. Okay, so let's start off with what is a 501c3? So when we say 501c3, what is that? Well, that number comes out of the tax code. And the US tax code is in Title 26 of the United States Code. And the United States Code is, you can think of it like, every time an act comes out of Congress, what they do is as soon as it's signed by the president, it goes back to a House committee, and the House committee figures out where that language in the new act gets applied within the US Code. So the US Code is the accumulation of all of the laws of the United States in subject order. So it's organized by title, and each title deals with a different area of the law. So Title 26 is tax. And you may remember, Title 17 is copyright, right? So each individual title, it deals with something else. So within the tax code, Section 501, subsection C, subsection 3, specifically discusses exemption from tax on corporations, certain trusts, etc. So what this section does is this section kind of outlines exactly, um, these are entities that are tax exempt organizations, that can be tax exempt organizations. And that's why 501c3 became associated with organizations that are tax exempt. That's why they're called 501c3 organizations, because they're organizations that are included within this section of the code. Now, I have this section separated by color because it delineates the different kind of requirements of a 501c3. So the yellow kind of just gives you the lists of the type of organizations. So you see community chest funds, foundations organized and operated exclusively for religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, educational, or to foster national, international amateur sports competition. Now, in green, it goes to, okay, of those organizations, no part of the net earnings of these organizations can go to the benefit of any individual or private shareholder. So that means they can't be for-profit companies. They can't be an individual company. And even further than that, they can't be a nonprofit corporation where any of the money goes to a personal, like anybody, earns profit. So you can't have a nonprofit, public company that's shareholders. And then no substantial part of the activities, which is carrying on propaganda or otherwise attempting to influence legislation. So you can't have a private tax exempt organization can't be a lobbyist, essentially. And they can't participate in or intervene in political campaigns, right? So they can't, there's very strict requirements on exactly how these organizations can participate in the political process, right? And I think a lot of you probably know that. It's not that far from us government entities, right? So they're very, very limited. And partly that has to do with kind of the history of how tax-exempt organizations came up. And I'm going to just briefly go through this because I find in the law especially that if you have an idea of what the history was of like what the purpose and the origins of the act or the law was, then you can kind of, it gives you a better understanding of the purpose of that law and how it's supposed to work. So as far as tax-exempt organizations, the history of tax-exempt organizations pretty much comes from, the way our country was built. So, in the beginning of our country, even going back to the very beginning when there were just settlements, right before the colonies, you had groups of people who were living together, and there was not a really good government structure, right? They were very loose structures, and sometimes from area to area, they could be different. And even when you got into the colonies, in the early days of the colonies, each colony was run by different groups. So those groups pretty much started to take care of themselves, right? So they had, if someone was in trouble or someone didn't have food or someone was ill or someone got injured, they learned to take care of themselves. And even public libraries were started in Philadelphia when Benjamin Franklin got together with some of his friends and they all started a kind of a book sharing group, right? And then that expanded. So a lot of, the charitable institutions in America really got their start from very local roots. Now there were some in England, I can't say that there were no charitable things in England. There were fraternal societies and some of those also came over to the US. But by and large, in the US, a lot of our kind of what you think of charities came from Americans or new settlers taking care of each other. In addition, government, in addition to being kind of in the beginning, not they didn't have time to pay attention to things like that, right? When they didn't have a strong framework and they were just trying to keep together and they were just trying to make sure they had a good constitution and that they were able to, have order. There was also this idea of a strong wariness of monarchy, right? So, they didn't go through all this trouble so that, the people weren't going to have a strong government that was going to tell them what they could do and, how they could do it and, how poor people were going to be largely dealt with. When the Industrial Revolution came along and you had large groups of, very wealthy people, like Carnegie and all of those people, that prompted philanthropy, right? Because they had literally more money than they knew what to do with. And they also had government connections. So what happened was, just to kind of summarize it, is, they created a lot of orphanages and social welfare societies, and they built libraries and schools and all kinds of things. But it wasn't completely altruistic because they also had government contacts where they were able, when, as tax in the late 1800s, when income tax started being a thing, they were able to kind of work it out that they could also benefit in a way from these philanthropic activities. So they would get tax exemptions. So from the very beginnings of US tax exemption was a thing. And they also built into that tax law the ability of individuals to donate and get tax exemptions or tax, deductions. So it's kind of two separate things. You have the ability of an entity to be tax exempt, which means that entity doesn't pay taxes, right? So the orphanage or the school doesn't pay taxes. You have the ability of people to donate to that entity and then save money on their taxes, which is kind of, that was done as a way to get people to donate. And that actually occurred around World War I, as tax rates went way up to support the war. The way to make that more palatable is they allowed now deductions. So you could, buy war bonds, or you could deduct, your donation to charities or your church. And then also the ability for corporations now to take tax deductions because of donations to charitable entities. So, they kind of went on. And then as we got through to the 50s and the 60s, some of these charitable organizations became so large and so powerful that it was thought that some brakes needed to be put on these, and it was more amount of oversight, right? So some of these organizations were so wealthy that it was thought, okay, we don't really know what's going on behind the scenes of these organizations, right? So we're giving them tax breaks, but we're not really sure what's happening. So that's when there happened to be more regulation, and there started to be more accountability and more filing and requirements on who could be a tax exempt organization, and then more stricter oversight on maintaining their tax exempt organization status. So that's just kind of a brief history. So being tax exempt is something that's really kind of long standing in our culture. It's been around as long as taxes have been around. So as you're considering a 501c3, usually when you say 501c3, people think tax exempt, right? They think it's a charity or, a tax exempt organization. Well, it's important to note that Michigan public libraries are all tax exempt already. Now, Michigan public libraries, and this does not necessarily hold true for every public library in the country, right? Because different states' libraries are established in different ways. So not every state's libraries are all government entities. So it's important to kind of make that distinction. But in Michigan, our libraries are all established through the through legislation established by municipalities. So they're all government entities, right? Public libraries are all government entities. And as such, they're tax exempt under different sections of the tax code. So under Section 115 of the tax code, government entities are tax exempt, right? So the revenue brought in by, you know, municipalities and cities and towns and states are not, are, you know, tax exempt. And you know, very often the buildings they build and all of that, they're exempt from the majority of taxes. In addition, there's another section of the tax code, which is 170C1, subsection C, subsection 1, which specifically makes charitable gifts to government entities, right? So state, a possession of the United States, or any political subdivision, which would be, you know, public libraries would be a political subdivision. Those are all tax deductible. So that means that, again, the libraries have those parts. A, libraries are tax exempt, and B, libraries can accept donations, and those donations are tax deductible. So in very similar manners to a 501c3, public libraries are already tax exempt. Now, there are a few little differences that we are going to get to in a minute, but if you're considering being a 501c3, I think it's important that you understand that you already are tax exempt. Now, can a public library be a 501c3? And there is some debate here. As I was doing some extra research for this presentation, I came across a couple memos written by other state libraries or written by other entities that posited that a public library cannot be a 501c3. And that's just not true. And if you need proof, there are several libraries in the state that are 501c3s in our state. But again, you know, when people ask questions and they say, well, you know, can I do this under the law? A lot of times the answer is, it depends. And again, we go back to that idea that different situations can have different outcomes, right? Depending on the facts and depending on how the library is set up. In general, okay, one of the examples I have at the top of this slide is a revenue ruling, which is an administrative ruling by the IRS, said that a public library that was organized as a separate entity under a state statute that did not have power to impose taxes, but whose funds are obtained by certification of a tax rate needed for its operation to the rate-making authority, qualifies for exemption. In other words, it's saying that a public library that's established under a state statute that is funded with taxpayer dollars, but that that library cannot levy its own taxes, is eligible for a 501c3. So that's just one example. Does that mean any other library cannot be a 501c3? Not necessarily. But that revenue ruling pretty much proves that any other document that says a library cannot be a 501c3 is wrong. A public library can be a 501c3. And it can be a little mind-blowing, okay? If you think 501c3 is usually nonprofit corporations. And so thinking of a government entity also being a 501c3 can be a little kind of confusing in terms of, well, how does that work? So we're going to kind of pick through that a little bit. In order to meet requirements to be a 501c3, a government entity first has to be separately organized, right? So it can't be an entity that, you know, was just created. Like if you're a home rule city library, it might be more difficult for you to be a 501c3, right? If your city just kind of created you one day. As opposed to, like, for example, a PA 164 library that was, you know, established by a vote of the people, or, you know, even a district library where it was, you know, a contractual agreement between multiple entities that kind of spun off this separate entity, and even other PA 164. So, you know, a lot of the libraries in Michigan are likely could be a 501c3. As long as they have a separate establishment, right? So it's separate establishment documentation, a separate, you know, establishment law. So it's separate from the government. And by having a separate board, so if you're a PA 164 and you're even a section 1, or you're a city, or you're a township library under PA 164, you have a separate governing board, right? So that separates you from the municipality. You have a separate governing body that creates its own separate rules and its own separate procedures for handling money and for dealing with employees. So it's kind of a separate organization, for lack of a better word. It has to pass the organizational test, which means it has to be established for one of those purposes that's cited in 501c3: religious, charitable, scientific, public safety, literary, or educational. Many of the 501c3s, public libraries, are probably going to be public charities. So it'll be, more charitable. And it also says its enabling documents must also have a dissolution clause, leaving assets to a comparable nonprofit. So in other words, if the library dissolves, where does the assets go? And in many cases, you'll see that, especially with district libraries, the assets go to, they'll say it goes back to this other, this original library that started the library. It cannot possess a disqualifying regulatory power. Ability to levy taxes, pass ordinances, have police, and you may say, well, a district library can levy taxes. Well, some of that depends on how you define the word levy, right? So a district library can decide to put a ballot on a question on the ballot, but that they're not the entity that actually collects the taxes and goes after the taxpayer and repossesses their property for non-payment of taxes. It cannot be an integral part of the state or municipal government. So and this has some qualifiers: whether the organization was created by executive order of the governor, whether the organization was created by executive order of the governor of a state as an official state agency, whether a state or state agency has the power to appoint and remove the organization's board, whether a state or state agency has the power to abolish the organization, whether a state or state agency monitors the organization activities, and whether the organization uses government employees to conduct its activities. So in most of those instances, most public libraries don't operate in that manner. So in most instances, again, every library is a little different and you could have some bumps in the road, but most of the time, public libraries in Michigan do not necessarily meet that standard. So let's talk a little bit about, what are the general benefits of being a 501c3. So if you were a nonprofit corporation, why would you want to be a 501c3? Why would anyone want to be a 501c3? Well, first of all, the obvious one is that you have an exemption from federal income tax, which is pretty big because usually federal income taxes are the heaviest taxes, right? Most often they're heavier than state taxes. Although I think maybe in some states that might be getting to be wrong. You can receive tax deductible contributions, right? Which if you were just a private nonprofit, that would not necessarily be the case. You have exemption from state income tax, most likely, depending on your state's laws, and employment taxes, again, depending on your state laws. You might have reduced postal rates. You might have exemption from federal unemployment tax. You can be eligible for tax-exempt financing. And you may be eligible, or you most often are eligible, to a lot of grants and foundation funding opportunities. Again, donations, which is a big plus to why public libraries a lot of times want to be one. So again, if you're a library, why do you want to be a 501c3? As a library, most of those pros that we just looked at are already available to you as a government entity and a tax-exempt entity. So what does a 501c3 offer a public library that their current status doesn't, right? Because as a government entity, right, Michigan Public Libraries have very limited tax obligations. So The IRS site will tell you, okay, government entities only have payroll tax, Social Security and Medicare withholding, and retirement plan reporting. Those are the only federal tax liabilities that public libraries as government entities have. So what's the draw to be a 501c3 library? Because there are cons that we're going to talk about in a minute. There are responsibilities for being a 501c3. So for public libraries, the benefits most likely are that you're identified as a verifiable and a credible charity. So essentially, to a grant-making entity, so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Target, Walmart, some of these large, well-known grant-making entities, look at that 501c3 as like what used to be the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, right? So if you think of yourself as a big grant making entity and you have hundreds, maybe thousands of applications for grants, if you have to go through each individual grant and verify that that individual entity is a nonprofit entity, that could take a lot of time. So requiring a 501c3 is one step. It's one less thing that these big grant making entities have to look at. Now, some of these big foundations also have a limitation on the amount of money they can give to government entities. So in having a 501c3 designation also generally tells the foundation that this is not a political organization, and it's not money that's going to go directly for paying the government to do what the government is supposed to do. It confirms that in order to be a 501c3, part of the process is that an entity has to prove that it has certain financial policies and practices in place, that it has certain governance policies and practices in place, that it maintains a certain level of financial reporting and a certain level of financial and non-financial record keeping. So again, that 501c3 designation gives those grant-making entities and foundations a certain amount of trust that, okay, this is an entity that is a good quality entity. It's not shady. It abides by all the rules, and it's going to handle the money the way that we want the money to be handled. There are some narrower things, like, for example, as a government entity, when a library receives donations, they can receive donations up to 30% of that individual donor's or taxpayer's contribution base. So if a taxpayer has a certain lump of money to give, they can give a certain amount to a public library, without incurring additional possible, taxes. Whereas a 501c3 can receive up to 50%. So there's some tax, benefits to donors to giving to a 501c3, as well as to those 501c3s. They can possibly get more money from a single donor, like a foundation. Private foundations can donate to 501c3s, pretty much, up to that kind of 50% level. But as far as donations, again, to government entities, because of that idea of political and giving money to the government for running the government kind of thing, they may have to pay some penalty taxes for money spent above a certain amount. So that is kind of a deterrent, because it adds extra work to these foundations, extra oversight and extra record keeping. So that's kind of a deterrent for some of these entities to give to government and government entities. And again, for public libraries, they have easier access to a lot of grant making and donation and partnering entities for all those reasons above. Again, there are some grant making entities that only want to work with 501c3s, again, because frankly, it's easier for them from an administrative standpoint, and they look at it as it being a little safer for them. Libraries already adhere to the political restrictions in a large extent that is imposed upon 501c3s. So a lot of the kind of negative things of a 501c3 are not that unfamiliar to public libraries as government entities. And we're going to talk right now about those cons. So what's a con of being a 501c3? Well, first, you're going to want to have an attorney to obtain this status. Now, could you get a 501c3 designation without having an attorney? You could, and there are ones that have. But it can be, it's a form you fill out. Again, we're going to talk about this a little bit more in another slide, but it can be a very challenging form. Again, depending on the entity and what their assets are and how they're structured, and what kind of explanations they might have to give. The status requires, in order to obtain and maintain, so getting a 501c3 is not just a matter of, okay, I'm going to apply for a 501c3, I'm going to get it, and then I never have to do anything again. No, once you become a 501c3, you now have annual reporting and record keeping requirements that you have to keep up with. If you don't, then you get your 501c3 recognition stripped away. And can you get it back? You can, but again, it can be sticky. So you're going to have to understand, what your requirements are and what you have to do in order to maintain them. So it can require extra administrative work. So there are certain governance policies and practices that not only do you have to prove that you have in order to get it, you have to maintain it. There are certain financial procedures and reporting that you have to not only have and show you have in order to get it, but you have to maintain it. And then there's record keeping, financial and non-financial record keeping, having to do with donations you receive and all of the money that you make, right? Because even though you're tax exempt, one of the little finicky things about being tax exempt is that if you make any money that is not related to your main purpose, right? So you're not making money, so from the library. So it's not your tax that you get. It's not donations you get to run the library, or summer reading, or things that you do as part of your library work and keeping it going. If you have any kind of side business where you're making money, then you may end up having to pay taxes on that. Now, I sat and thought and tried to think of an instance where a library might have that side business. And the only thing I could think of would be if the library, say, owned a separate building or a separate concern that maybe someone left them, and they were running it in order to earn money, but it was a completely different kind of business than a library. In that instance, they may end up having to pay taxes. And that could, that can be complicated and a problem. But I don't think that's something that most libraries need to worry about. So some additional requirements for maintaining your status. We talked about governance procedures, financial procedures. You want to make sure that you have good knowledge and current awareness of regulations and laws. You have to have somebody who's going to be on top of when certain regulations change and when laws change, because they do change. We just recently went through a very large tax code change, and it could happen again. So it's something that you're going to have to make sure that you have either a very good accountant or an attorney or someone who can make sure that they keep track of that for you. Now, let's talk a little bit about myths of tax exempt status. So one more thing I want to talk about the prior slide about cons. So, in other words, if you are a very small library with a very small staff, then, it's something that, could you be a 501c3? Yes. But again, it's something that you want to step carefully into and make sure that, you're able to handle all of the requirements. So let's talk about some myths of tax exempt status. So some myths are that a library is not eligible to apply for grants if it is not a 501c3. Well, while there are some grants that say they only want 501c3s, it is important that you read all your grants very carefully. And I know that most of you, know this and probably do this. I've been looking at a lot of grants lately, as I've been doing some research to see if I could find some like COVID money for libraries and that kind of thing. And I even subscribe to a grant list, where you get grants pushed to you on different topics. And some of the things I've been finding is that you may have a grant that says they want 501c3 entities, but then as you read through the grant more, it says, or government entities, or it says entities eligible under 170c1. So remember, 170c1 is the eligibility for a government entity to receive tax deductible contributions or donations. So if you see that language in a grant, even if it's asking for a 501c3, then there is a little, crick in the door allowing government entities to apply. So it would definitely be worth it to contact the grant making entity and say, okay, I'm a government entity, I'm a public library, and I'm tax exempt under this and this, would I be able to apply for this grant? Because one of the reasons why they'll say they want 501c3s is because they don't want private nonprofits that are not vetted, or they don't want charities that are actually maybe for profit. So it's, sometimes it's not that they don't want government entities, it's that they don't want some other things, and they're just using that 501c3 to carve out those other entities. So sometimes by contacting them and talking to them, sometimes you're able to kind of wrangle in and get yourself a application. Not always, but sometimes. Now, also, the IRS provides a government designation letter. And this is a letter from the IRS that pretty much states that you are a nonprofit, you have tax exempt status under these sections of the code, and it carries weight because it's written by the IRS. So these designation letters can also carry some weight with entities that are looking for a 501c3. Now, also, it could be that sometimes with these foundations, again, they just can't donate to any kind of government entity, and that's just the way it is. But, again, I have been finding lately that there are some grants out there where there is that little door open. It's not all of them, but there are some. So the next myth is that a library with a 501c3 is a nonprofit corporation. Well, libraries are nonprofit, that's true, but they're not corporations. And that's an important distinction, because even if you are a 501c3 library, you're still a government entity. Getting a 501c3 designation does not change your establishment. It does not change your core organizational foundation. Okay, you don't all of a sudden become a nonprofit corporation. You're still a government entity with that label showing that you're a verified charity. And lastly, 501c3 entities pay no taxes. Nope, that's not true. There are some taxes you still have to pay: payroll taxes, some unemployment taxes, and as I said, you may have to pay taxes on any income derived from unrelated activities. So if you run, an ice cream stand, or the library has like a snack bar attached to it where it is nothing to do with library, you may have to pay taxes on that income. So what happens if a library can't be a 501c3? Does that mean they're just out of luck? Well, the purpose of a 501c3, as I said, is the federal tax exemption and the authority of that label, right? So as we just mentioned, public libraries are tax exempt by nature, so communication is key, right? You want to obtain that government designation letter. You can look for governmental and community organizational grants that don't require 501c3 status. They are out there. I have a couple links on here to some. Um, there are some larger grant kind of databases, like the Michigan Grant Finder. That's the one that I signed up for just to look to see, that have been pushing through grants related to COVID that are aimed at um, community organizations and government, community governmental organizations that have to do with things like serving, populations and digital awareness and digital literacy. So there are some things out there that, you don't necessarily have to be a 501c3, and even some that are really aimed at government entities. So it might be harder to find money if you're not a 501c3, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't any out there. So when you're considering a 501c3, you want to make sure you engage an attorney. I know that there's some libraries that are less able to afford them, but I can definitely assure you that it is worth the money. Okay. You want to weigh the benefits and detractions of a 501c3, and this is part of talking to that attorney. Is this worth it for us? You want to do your homework and see, what are we going to have to do to even be able to be a 501c3? And then once we attain 501c3 status, what are we going to have to do to maintain it? You want to, figure out, why do you want to be a 501c3? What really is your true aspiration to be a 501c3? You want to be patient, because the 501c3 process can be pretty straightforward, but it can also be more frustrating. Again, it all depends on the individual entity and how it's set up and what its establishment was and what its documentation is. Sometimes this form goes back and forth and you have to keep coming up with more documentation. You want to make sure you assemble as many documents as possible about your establishment, about your financials, about your procedures, your bylaws, how your board works. All of that are things that are considered under getting 501c3 status. Now, so what do we do? You've done all the homework. You want to be a 501c3. What do you do? Well, of course, you're going to want to get your attorney, but 501c3 is all about filling out a form. It's form 1023. There's also a 1023EZ. And this form, it's all about detail and accuracy. If you don't supply the information that the form asks for in the way the form wants it, the IRS will kick it back to you. And if you, don't provide true information or correct information or information that matches the documentation, they'll kick it back to you. So it's very easy for the IRS to reject your application. So you want to make sure that, again, you take your time and you work with your lawyer and you kind of do it one step at a time in order to get your 501c3 done. And again, depending on the library, depending on how they operate now and the documentation they have, some libraries may have an easier time than others. There is lots of assistance available through the IRS. And I have a link here. There's lots of documentation, there's videos, there's virtual courses you can take on why do you want to be a 501c3, how do you be a 501c3. There's something called the life cycle of a charitable organization, and it walks you through everything from what is a 501c3, how do I become a 501c3, to maintaining your 501c3 status. So it's definitely worth a look. And then finally, I have a page of resources here, which are the bulk of the resources that I used when I was compiling this presentation. And there's some very helpful stuff here. There's a useful document from the Iowa State Library that's kind of specific to libraries and 501c3s, but you want to take note that it is from Iowa, so it does refer to some Iowa state laws and some Iowa library establishment stuff, but overall it can be a very useful, and I found it an interesting document. So that is about libraries and becoming 501c3s. And if I can assist in any way, if you need an attorney and you do not have one, I do have a list of attorneys who practice, largely it's municipal law, but that they work with libraries and they do library law as well. I'm happy to share that at any time. I have some from a pretty large area of the state. I can't say I have attorneys from every area of the state, but there are quite a few. So I'm happy to share that. And if there's ever anything else I can help you with, don't hesitate to ask. And I think it looks like we have some time for some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Claire. That was incredibly informative. I know I really appreciate it. And like I said at the beginning of the presentation, if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box. I know there were a couple that came through in the Q&A feature that were answered during the presentation, but please submit any questions that you may have in the chat box. I'll give a couple minutes to see if any come through, and if not, we'll wrap it up a little bit early today. But thank you so much again, Claire. Just seeing some comments, just best view they've heard, but no questions so far. So we'll give you just a couple more minutes and then we'll wrap it up.
It takes a little while to digest tax.
Yeah.
It's not, like I said, it's not the most scintillating of topics.
But it isn't very important. So
yeah, it is, and it can be very useful. So it's a good reference document, but yeah, it's not particularly controversial.
Yeah, that's a good word. Yeah, I'll go with that. Open. Thanks, Claire. You made that painless. So maybe that's a better word. Catch painless. So, well, I have not seen any questions come through, so I think we will wrap it up. I know you put your phone number and your email address on the screen, so I think attendees know that they're welcome to reach out to you, like you had mentioned. They're also welcome to reach out to MLA if there are any questions, as well as that tax law starts to digest within your mentioned. Right. So again, one more time, thank you so much, Claire. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we are going to wrap it up. So I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your day. And I know I'm here in Lansing and it's pretty sunny out. So hopefully it's sunny where you are and get to enjoy a day of nice weather.
Thank you.
Yeah. Have a good day, everyone.